Why am I talking about this? I think the countries of Russia and Ukraine have been in the news a lot, especially for the last 8 months. And they've been at war for 8 months. And the majority of people in those countries claim to be Orthodox Christians. But I don't think many Western Christians know much about the history of the countries or the people or how they came to be Christians. I did a postgraduate diploma in theology at Durham University in England, 2 years of church history, and we covered virtually nothing of this. I majored in church history at UNISA, and we covered virtually nothing of this. So most Western Christians, I think, don't know very much about it. It begins in the 9th century. In 867, the Patriarch of Constantinople wrote to the other patriarchs of the church at that time and said that the people of Rus were becoming Christians and were eagerly accepting the Christian faith. And the patriarchs that he wrote to at that time, the churches had 5 major centers. There was Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Constantinople. And though the bishops of those 5 centers were called patriarchs, and they were the sort of chief bishops of the churches in their areas. And so he wrote to them to say that there was this news that this people called Rus were becoming Christians. In 868, the church in Constantinople sent missionaries to Moravia, which is where the Czech Republic and Slovak Republic are now. And they sent 2 missionaries called Constantine and Methodius, who went to that place and learned the local language and started teaching the people the Christian faith. But there were also Western missionaries there from Germany and France, and they were Franks. And so there was a bit of a clash between them, because Moravia was sort of on the boundaries between the area under Rome and the area under Constantinople. And the Germans and the Franks were under Rome, and these missionaries had come from Constantinople. One of the things that they fought about was that in the what is commonly called the Nicene Creed, the Franks had added a phrase to say that the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father and the Son. And at that time, that phrase wasn't used in Rome, and it wasn't used in Constantinople. And so there was a bit of an argument about that. But the bigger argument was about what language to use. And the people from the West, the Germans, said that the only languages that could be used in church were the ones that Pilate wrote on the cross: Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. No other language could be used for Christian worship. And so here were these guys from Constantinople translating the scriptures and church texts into the local language. They even invented an alphabet for it, because they thought the Latin alphabet or the Greek alphabet wasn't adequate to produce the sounds in this language, which is nowadays known as Old Church Slavonic, because they produced the written version of that language. And so they went to Rome to say, you know, can we sort out this squabble? Which way should we do things? And after discussing it, eventually the Pope of Rome consecrated Methodius as a bishop, and the other one, Constantine, died and became known as Saint Cyril, as one of the great missionary saints of the church. And Methodius went back, but the quarrels continued. And eventually his disciples moved to what is now Bulgaria, and they planted the church in Bulgaria. But these two, Cyril and Methodius, are called the apostles to the Slavs. And then further to the east, there were this people called the Rus. And after Methodius died and they moved to Bulgaria, there were people in the town of Kiev. And it's very difficult now nobody knows really how to pronounce it anymore, because they keep changing the way it's transliterated to English. And if you look at the Ukrainian spelling of it, it is Kyiv. And in English it sounds better as Kiev. But they now write it in English as if it's pronounced Kiev. And so I'm just going to call it Kiev. The people there that came to be called the Rus were actually Scandinavians, and they were traders between the Baltic and the Black Sea. And Kiev was on the Dnieper River, which is a main trade route, and they were a bit like the people who 70 years later invaded England, the Normans, who were also Scandinavian descent, and they ruled the local people. And so the ordinary people, the main population was Slavic, but these Scandinavian people were called Varangians. And one of the prominent Christians among them was a Princess Olga. And her sons were all pagans, but she was a Christian. And the one who succeeded her was very much a pagan. And the next one who succeeded her, Vladimir, was a sort of very much committed pagan, and he erected shrines all over the town. But then he began to feel that it wasn't really enough, and various people came to him, missionaries. Christians came, Muslims came, Jews came, and he looked at all this and he wanted to learn more about it. So it is said that he sent people out to say, go to where those people live and find out how it works. And some of them went east and some went west, and the ones who had gone to Constantinople came and they said, we thought we were in heaven when we were in church with them in Constantinople. And so he invited missionaries from Constantinople to come to his kingdom. And in 988, he said to all the people of Kiev, come and be baptized. And most of them came. Some of them may have come out of curiosity. What's the prince saying? Come and be baptized. But from then on, Christianity had got a firm root in place. Previously, there had been Christians there, they had worshipped, but most of the people knew little about it. It was just a few who were Christians. And suddenly the Christian message was being preached to lots of people. And so within a few years, it had spread throughout the area on the map that you see there. The darkest portion, it's not very clear there, but the central portion is dark around Kiev, and that was where it first spread. And eventually it spread throughout that region. And that region became known as Kievan Rus. And as I said, the rulers were mostly these Scandinavians, and the ordinary people were East Slavic. But what really got the gospel to spread was, first of all, they got missionaries from Constantinople, and then some of the local people, particularly two who are remembered a lot, was Antony and Theodosius. And Antony went to the Mount Athos, where there are lots of monasteries. It's a kind of monastic republic, they call it. It's still there today. And it's inhabited almost solely by monks. And he went there, and he went to a monastery, he became a monk, and then he came back and started a monastery in Kiev. And he dug himself a cave to live in. And various others joined him, including this guy Theodosius. And they, in the middle of this capital of Kievan Rus, they started a monastery, and people came to join them. And they followed a life of prayer. And they went out to various parts and started other monasteries. And through that, the Christian faith took root. But it also had problems because most of the people were not within range of proper teaching. And so there was what is called in Russian dvoyeverие, there are two ways, double-mindedness. So some people had the old ways in mind, and they mixed them up in their thought, and they would switch from one to another. And so the Christian faith took root among, first of all, the ruling class, who were the Scandinavians, and then through the monks to other people. But there was also a sort of pagan underground, as it were. In 1054, there was a split between Rome and Constantinople, two churches. And I mentioned before there was this addition to the creed, which had by 1054 taken root in Rome as well. And in 1054, 3 legates from the Roman Pope went to Constantinople and made a whole list of things that they thought that the church in Constantinople was doing wrong. And among other things, they accused them of omitting this phrase from from the Father and the Son. And the original version was, we believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father, who with the Father and the Son together is worshipped and glorified. And they added, who proceeds from the Father and the Son. And so now they accused the people in Constantinople of leaving it out. And there were a few other things that they added, that they used leavened bread for communion and some other things. And they excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople. And so he, in turn, excommunicated these three legates who went back to Italy. But by the time they got there, the Roman Pope who'd sent them had died. And so nobody actually sorted out this problem. And what happened over the next couple of hundred years was that because they were playing not speaks, the Roman Constantinople, there were theological developments in either place that the other side had never heard of. And so they were never fully discussed. And this comes up later. In 1240, the Kievan Rus was conquered by what came to be called the Golden Horde. It was a state from Mongolia which conquered most of Eastern Asia and nearly all of Western Asia and a lot of Eastern Europe. And there you can see where it had almost reached to. In 1240, Kiev was destroyed by the Mongol, the Golden Horde. And most of the cities in that Kievan Rus were destroyed. They just invaded them and they flattened them. There were only two that weren't destroyed, and that was one called Pskov and one called Novgorod, which were in the extreme northwest of that Kievan Rus area. And all the rest were destroyed, and they ruled the place. They didn't much interfere with the life of Christians, but they changed the mentality of the people. Because for a couple of hundred years, they were overlords, and any of the local people who met a Mongolian had to bow down to him and do whatever he said. You know, when Jesus said, if someone asks you to go a mile, go 2, and that was like the Romans in Palestine. The Romans were the sort of colonial overlords, and the local people had to do what Romans said. And it's not been unknown in Southern Africa. My mother had a cousin. This is in what is now Zambia, but was then known as Northern Rhodesia. And her husband would walk along the pavement in town, and if a black man didn't get off the pavement for him, he would push a burning cigarette into the back of his neck to show that the colonial rulers were boss. And in Rus, that was how the Mongolians treated the locals. They didn't interfere much with the local government. All they cared about was that they must come to the capital, which was called Sarai, and they must bow down before the Khan, and they must bring him the taxes. So it was really money and allegiance that they were after. But this feeling of being enslaved also made a profound impression on people. The Mongolians ruled for a long time, and a few years after they had conquered the Kievan Rus, they became Muslims. Now, this is an interesting thing. Why did they become Muslims? They had conquered a country that was largely Christian. Why didn't the Christians evangelize? And they became Muslims after they had conquered. The Norse people who conquered England, within a couple of 100 years, most of them had become Christians. They adopted the religion of their conquerors. But here, the conquerors adopted a different religion. And so there was a kind of failure of mission here. That's something for historians to work on. The western part of this Rus area, then as a result of this Mongol conquest, they became split. And what was then Kievan Rus is now divided into 3 different countries today. There's Ukraine and Russia and Belarus. And the history of the resistance to the Mongol conquest shows how they were divided. And just before the Mongols conquered them, one of the reasons that they fell so easily was that they had become disunited. Different principalities in Kievan Rus, each local prince did his own thing. And part of the result of that was that each local prince tried to control the church. And so the church tended to become under the control of secular rulers. When they had been united, there had been a kind of symphony between the church and the state. And the early years of Kievan Rus were an example of a country, a people trying to become Christians. Prince Vladimir, when he first became Christian, not only went to church and worshipped, but he changed the way he ruled. They used to give huge banquets to impress all the other princes. And he was the grand prince, so he would give huge banquets to impress the other princes. When he became Christian, he had huge banquets, but he invited the poor and the weak and the sick to come to the banquets. He abolished capital punishment in his territories, which horrified the Greek missionaries. They said, you can't run a country like that. And he said, well, the gospel says you cannot kill people. And so the church had a say in how the country was ruled. It spoke of justice and mercy. And the country became more just and merciful. But a few centuries later, just before the Mongols came, the rulers had become more independent and they had become more interested in their own power. And so they tried to control the church. And so that changed the relationship between church and state. The Mongols were driven out in the 14th century, but in different ways in different places. In the West, it was the rise of Lithuania as a power, and the Duke of Lithuania became the King of Poland and vice versa. So Lithuania and Poland had the same ruler. But Poland was very much Western in its religion. It was strongly Roman Catholic. And the Lithuanians came to rule more, and they took over what is now Western Ukraine. And at one point, the Ukrainians, who in the West were called Ruthenians, formed a kingdom called Ruthenia. And to keep the Poles quiet, the king of Ruthenia, who was Orthodox, went to Rome and became a vassal of Rome, of the Pope of Rome. He was also a vassal of the Khan of the Golden Hawk, so he was playing it both ways. And managed to play them all off against each other. And for a couple of 100 years, the kingdom of Ruthenia was more or less independent by sort of diplomatically manipulating these people. But eventually, the Poles and Lithuanians formed a commonwealth, which became very powerful, and they conquered most of what is now Ukraine. And they conquered the kingdom of Ruthenia. In 1327, there was a rivalry between two princes of northeastern Rus. So this was not under the Lithuanians, but the princes of Tver and Moscow were in rivalry for power, and the Prince of Moscow sort of sicked the Mongols onto the Prince of Tver. So they put him down, and so the Prince of Moscow became more powerful. And so this led to the rise of Moscow as a center, and their power spread out in the northeastern part. And eventually they moved the chief bishop, who was the Metropolitan of Kiev, was moved to Moscow. And he kept the title of Metropolitan of Moscow and Kiev to remember the history, but it became a more powerful center. And in 1380, the Prince of Moscow defeated the Mongol armies, and so Moscow became more independent and gradually became the most influential center there. So there was Muscovy, and there was the Kingdom of Ruthenia, which was then eventually conquered by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And Moscow became independent. Also in the 15th century, the place that had originally sent missionaries, Constantinople, was conquered by the Turks. And so a lot of people in what had been the Kievan Rus thought this was a sign at the end of the world. And in the Byzantine calendar that they used, it was 120 years or 7,000 years since their formal date of the creation of the world. And they said, well, if God made the world in 7 days, maybe in 7,000 years it will end. There was a missionary in the Muscovy area, St. Stephen of Perm, and he went out to preach the gospel to people out in Bundu, and people in Moscow said, why are you doing that? The world's going to end in 120 years. Why are you translating all this stuff into those languages? They're not going to use it. So there was this feeling that things were bad. And then, to crown it all, the people of Constantinople had been worried about the pressure of the Turks who were attacking them, and they asked the Pope of Rome, from whom they were now separated, to send an army to have a crusade against the Turks to save them. And they had a conference, a synod, to reunite the churches of Rome and Constantinople. And so they held it in Florence, and all the bishops who went from Constantinople and its area to Rome agreed on a scheme of union, all except one. It was Bishop Mark of Ephesus. And when they got back, having agreed on the scheme, nobody that they went back to agreed with it. They said, but you haven't sorted out the theological issues. There are still theological differences. And 3 centuries after the split, the theological differences had grown so that they'd become more than just the original ones that caused the split, but there was also a different culture. And so in Moscow, when they took this Turkish conquest of Constantinople as a sign of saying it's God's judgment on them for agreeing to this faulty scheme of union. And so they said the Constantinople, which was regarded as the new Rome, has now fallen. And they said the first Rome fell, and now the second Rome has fallen. So Moscow must be the third Rome, because Moscow is the last place where the church is not under the control of Muslims. And with the fall of Constantinople, the Roman Patriarch had gone off and they were separated from them, and the others, Antioch, Alexandria and Jerusalem, had all been under Muslim rule for a long time. So Moscow was the only Orthodox Christian center that was independent, and newly independent because they had just chased the Mongols out. In the area of Kiev, the Lithuanian and Polish Commonwealth ruled, and people in Ukraine found that the Polish element was oppressive, and the Russians, who had become now powerful under the princes of Muscovy, Moscow, began to influence the Lithuanian Polish Commonwealth, and they put political pressure on it. And so there were two rebellions. There was a rebellion in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth called the Confederation of Bar, which was people who felt that the government was too subservient to Moscow. They were being influenced. And so they rebelled against that. And then in Ukraine, there was a group of people who rebelled against the Bar Confederation. And they were led by the Cossacks, who were Orthodox people who lived in central and eastern Ukraine. And they fought for and gained independence of the Polish-Lithuanian Confederation. And the Polish and Lithuanian Commonwealth continued to control Western Ukraine. And so the newly independent Cossacks made an agreement with Moscow, but there was a difference in the church, because in the church in Ukraine, where the Cossacks were, was more independent of the government. And in Moscow, as I said earlier, it had become more dependent on the government. The state tended to dominate the church, although they remained distinct. And so there was a bit of tension between these two. Later, in the 17th century, a king appeared in Moscow, Peter I, who didn't care about the Orthodox faith at all. And he wasn't interested in the church. But what he was interested in was making Russia a powerful country. And he went, when he was young, he went on a tour of Western Europe. And there they had a philosophy of the divine right of kings. And in Germany, they had an understanding of the relationship of church and state, where the ruler decided what the church was to be. Whatever the ruler said, that was what the church should be, that was what the religion should be. And he liked these ideas, which were modern ideas. He was very into modernity, and this was the height of the Enlightenment, which shaped modernity. And so he came back to Russia and was determined to modernize it, and in a sense to secularize it. And so he abolished the Patriarchate of Moscow, which had become a patriarchate independent of Constantinople, partly because Constantinople was under the Turks. And he abolished it and set up a synod of bishops with a procurator appointed by himself, who was to control it. So in effect, the church became a department of state. And it was actually called that in government documents. It was called the Department of the Orthodox Confession. And so the church became a department of state and was controlled and ruled by the state, except for going back to Antony and Theodosius of the Caves of Kiev, the monastic movement, which continued to go through and spread the Christian faith, and people who wanted to really live as Christians became monks. And the in the time when they had reconquered the land and regained it from Mongol rule, the center of the Christian faith was a monk called Sergius of Radonezh, and he is one of the most loved saints of Russia. And he founded something like 180 monasteries. And these monasteries would go away from everything. They would go out into the loneliest places, and local people would come to them and ask for prayers, and they would pray for them, and they would be healed, and they would come and ask for help, and they would help them. And so this monastic movement, which spread throughout the Russian lands, became known as Holy Russia. There was something there that was a core of holiness. And there was also the understanding, there were two ways of understanding this. One is that it's Holy Russia because of these holy people, the people who spread the Christian faith, the people who kept the faith, who were mostly the monks, and most of the people who wanted to know about the Christian faith went to the monks. In Russia, there were two kinds of clergy. There were the black clergy and the white clergy. And the black clergy were the monks, and the white clergy were the priests in the parishes, who were very often poorly educated and very often very badly treated, and very often lived immoral lives. And so when people wanted the Christian faith, they found, well, the parish clergy very often, not always, but very often, were not up to it. And so they would go and find teaching at the monasteries. And so in Russia, they grew up a tradition of spiritual elders. There are two kinds of elders. There are ordained elders, who are called priests. It comes from the Greek word presbytera, which means elder. Presbyteros is just an English word, priest is just a shortening of that. And in Greek, there are two words. In English, we say elder, but in Greek, there are two words. The presbyteros means an elder, and the hieron also means an elder. And the hieron was a spiritual elder. And many of the monks were these kind of spiritual elders. And that was the holiness of Holy Russia. That Russia was holy because this Russian movement of the monks was holy. But others came to interpret it differently and saying it's not holy because it's godly, it's holy because it's Russian. And after the 17th century, there was a movement of nationalism, and that nationalism affected all these areas as it affected a lot of others. And so we have these two ways of thinking. What is Holy Russia? Is it Russia that has been touched by the holiness of God? Or is it the holiness of being Russian? And the same happened in the other places, in what is now Ukraine and in Belarus. This nationalism grew. And so there is a kind of Christian holiness on the one hand, and there is a nationalistic feeling on the other. In 1721, going back to Peter the Great in Russia, he conquered the Swedish Empire, and then they declared Russia to be an empire, with he, Peter the Great, now became the emperor of Russia, and they began an imperial conquest. one of his successors was Catherine the Great, who conquered Ukraine, both the bits that had been under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and took over the bits that had been loosely related to Russia before. And she too was a westernized, secular kind of ruler. The church was already, through her predecessor, under the state. And in her time, there was a rebellion in Ukraine, which put more of Ukraine in her power. And then Russia and Austria and Prussia divided the Polish-Ukrainian Federation between them. There were 3 partitions of Poland, and by the third one, at the end of the 18th century, there was none of Poland left. And so the Western Ukraine had now become part of Russia. But while it was part of the Polish Federation, as I said, the Polish element under the King of Poland was very much Western Roman Catholic. And they had conquered these Orthodox Ruthenians. And the Ruthenian bishops in this situation decided that it would be better for them if they came under the Pope of Rome. And so they had a union called the Union of Brest-Litovsk. That was the town where they had decided it, to say that the Ruthenian bishops would now come under the Pope of Rome. And this particular group, the Orthodox call them Uniats, they call themselves something else, but they had become, in effect, Roman Catholics, but they kept a lot of the Orthodox features, like married priests, and they kept using their own language instead of Latin. But in other ways, they were under the Pope of Rome. And so they had become semi-Westernized. And when Catherine the Great conquered this area, she didn't like this idea, so they had to become Orthodox again. And so there was this tension, particularly in Western Ukraine, between East and West. They were being pulled apart. Then in the 20th century came the Bolshevik Revolution. And the Bolsheviks' aim was to complete what Peter the Great had started. Peter the Great wanted to modernize Russia, and the Bolsheviks were modernity on steroids. Yeah, they really wanted to do away with everything pre-modern, because they said the history is divided into periods, and there is a period of feudalism, and there's a period of capitalism, and there is a period of communism, which is the ultimate. And that was their interpretation of modernity taken to the ultimate, and their aim was to build that kind of society. And when they took over in 1917, There was first in Russia, at the end of the First World War, there was a liberal revolution. And they said, the war has devastated the country. They asked the Tsar to abdicate, and they set up a kind of liberal democratic republic, and they set the church free. And the church for the first time held a free synod without the state watchdog telling them what to do. And so they restored the Patriarchate of Moscow, and they set up the independent church. And then 6 months later, the Bolsheviks took over, and they wanted the church back under their control, and they wanted to abolish it. They wanted no religion at all. So they confiscated most of the churches, and they confiscated the theological schools. And by that time, the Russia they inherited, they reconquered Ukraine, which had declared itself an independent republic for about 5 years. And the Bolsheviks really ruled with an iron fist. They controlled everything. But as a result of all those wars, there was famine and starvation. And so Lenin had what he called a new economic policy. He would compromise. He would allow a mixed economy of state-controlled enterprises and capitalist enterprises. And when Lenin died, Stalin took over, and he said, this is nonsense. And so Stalin embarked on a program of rapid industrialization, and they drew up 5-year plans, what they were going to achieve in this way. And so they rapidly industrialized, and they collectivized agriculture. And the collectivization of agriculture was partly to say, under the new economic policy of Lenin, the peasants were free to produce their produce and to sell it and so on. But the new industrialization meant that they didn't produce enough food to feed the rapidly growing cities. And so when they collectivized agriculture, which was very much forced top-down, the peasants resisted. And there were 3 classes of peasants, according to the Bolsheviks. There were rich peasants, there were poor peasants, and there were middle peasants. And the rich peasants were called kulaks. They were ones who had more than 8 acres of land. And the kulaks particularly resisted this. And so Stalin sent his heavies into all the areas and said, we will take whatever grain is on your quota, and you can have what's left. But the collective farms had to produce this quota of grain. And if there was nothing left, there was nothing left. And so they came and took it forcibly. And as a result, over much of the Soviet Union, there was starvation among the peasants because they'd taken all the grain to feed the people in the cities. And the one place that was worst affected in this was particularly eastern Ukraine, which is a big grain growing area. If you look at the Ukrainian flag, you can see it's got blue for the sky and yellow for the corn. That is how they see the country. And so Stalin's policy affected Ukrainians more than most other people, but it affected the whole of the Soviet Union. But one of the interpretations of this, the Ukrainian word for that period is Holodomor, which means death by starvation, because millions of peasants died because of the seizure of the grain. But the Ukrainian nationalists interpret this as a Russian plot to kill the Ukrainians. And so in this century of history, we can see that this people, the Kievan Rus, got split into three with a common history. But they also, because of their political divisions that were brought about by various kinds of conquests, by the Mongols, by the Polish-Lithuanian Confederation, and various others. By these conquests, they were divided, and so they came to see themselves as separate people. And that's fine, except that, as in a lot of other places, the extreme nationalists among all of them tend to point a finger at the others and say, they are the enemy. And so we look at the present day conflict, and we also have to say, why is it that the church leaders don't call them to peace? Because that's what the Christian gospel is. Back in Kievan Rus, there was at one point a bishop who said to the prince, we are here to restrain you from bloodshed. And if you look at the Orthodox theology and the canons of the church, they say the Orthodox Church isn't like the Mennonites and the Quakers, it's not a peace church. It doesn't say Christians may not join the army, but it does say that if you join the army and if you kill someone in battle, that is a sin that you need to confess and repent. In our law, our Western law, there is such a thing as culpable homicide, but you can also say, you can plead self-defense to say that homicide is justified. You can justify killing someone. But in the Orthodox theology, you cannot justify killing. There is no such thing as a just war. People may be caught up in wars and they may take up arms and they may fight. But if you kill someone, you cannot justify it. You can only repent. You cannot say this was justified. But today, as I said, there are two things. There is, as in Russia, there is Holy Russia, which was the monks who preached and lived the gospel. And people could see them living the gospel. And it was that living the gospel that made them Holy Russia. But there is also the nationalist thing that says Holy Russia is because Russians are more holy than anyone else, or Ukrainians or Belarusians or whatever. And the same applies in every other country. But there is still the thing that these church leaders say, they say, yes, it's tragic. And we say, well, We can call this, because they all have a common ground in Kiev and Rus. We can say it's fratricidal strife. These are brothers who are fighting. It's like the descendants of Jacob and Esau. Their descendants fought. And so we can say it's fratricidal strife. But if you say that, the nationalists say, you are denying our right to independence by calling us brothers with them. And it's not confined to these three countries. Nationalism is all over. And so we read a lot about Christian nationalism, which was the ruling ideology of South Africa from 1948 to 1994. And it's now resurfacing in America. And in all this, I think we need to think about the distinction I mentioned of what is Holy Russia, or holiness, wherever it may be.